And we do have somebody today who has a very special story, and that I know has not been easy to share. In fact, I think he went most of his life, just the last few years, without sharing it at all, because he's a Holocaust survivor. Judah Samet is a Holocaust survivor who recently started speaking about it, and he's agreed to come here today. His good friend Bill Lintz, and maybe some of you know him, went out to Oakland and picked him up and brought him here to share his story. And Judah, I'll have you know, is a veteran, but not of the United States military. He's Israeli airborne. So you know he's crazy. Jumping out of airplanes. Judah Samet, please come.
As a preamble to what I'm going to say, first of all, I think every American owes a heartfelt thank you to any veteran in this country, but especially myself and my family. We were saved by Americans.
I want to make sure everybody hears you, Judah, so I'm going to make sure this is right up close to your mouth, okay?
So if somebody here happens to be from the 30th Division Infantry, Old Hickory, I'd like to thank him very personally. They are the ones who saved us from a death train, the third one. I had to condense my story for time reasons, so I'm going to go straight to it. My name is Abraham Judah Samet. I was born February 5, 1938 in Debrecen, Hungary, to an Orthodox Jewish family. We were very religious. I was the third son, following my oldest brother Moshe and my brother Yaakov. I was followed by my sister Henya. My father Yekutiel and my mother Rachel operated 2 knitting factories. We were prosperous and had a good life with a big question mark on it, because that was even before the Germans arrived in Hungary. But the Arrow Cross, the reason they called themselves Arrow Cross, because the spokes of the cross ended up like arrows. And they were a rabidly nationalistic, anti-Semitic organization. They were like the skinheads that you hear about. They gained power, and they themselves managed to kill 100,000 Jews in Hungary. In 1941, the Hungarian government allied itself with Hitler. It was a kind of puppeteer relationship. This allowed the Arrow Cross Party, a rabidly nationalistic and anti-Semitic organization, to enter Hungarian government and controlled it. The situation for the Jewish community became intolerable. Jews lost virtually all rights. The Jew laws that had been enacted in Germany became laws in Hungary too. It precluded the Jews from all professions, such as doctors, lawyers, engineers, and so forth. Their movement was limited by restricting them to streetcars only. Their property was taken from them. At the same time, beatings and killings by Arrow Cross became endemic. One night, my father was on his way home from work. He was attacked by a gang that included one of his factory workers. Shortly thereafter, he got us all passports and tickets to America, where we had family. We would not get the opportunity to leave. Figuring that one of his workers would actually want to kill him was the sign that it was time for us to leave. We left everything there, we didn't take anything. Sometimes in late March or early April 1944, maybe 70 years to today's date, during lunch hour, we heard the sound of good steps moving up our street and stopping in front of our house. We kind of lived in the middle of the street across from the synagogue. We heard a voice using a megaphone barking out loud commands, ordering us to assemble outside within 15 minutes. We were told to leave everything except for our valuables, our papers, and some changes of underwear. We were told that they are taking us to a better place. A better place. We collected those and carried them out in a small suitcase. We saw the Gestapo accompanying a platoon of Hungarian gendarmerie. And those gendarmerie were just as murderous as the Arrow Cross. They harried us by yelling, screaming, pushing, shoving, and beating, marching us to the rail station. It was a cold and rainy day. And many couldn't keep the pace, whether young or old. At the station, we were joined by many more Jews from the countryside. My mother volunteered to cook for the masses. She was provided with bed tops, vegetables, some potatoes, and a small amount of beef from local farms. She made 4 tops of soup. That was the fare for the day, every day until the transport arrived. The starvation had begun. There were some, God knows, 10,000 or so many thousand there, and obviously 4 tops was not enough. We expected 2 transport trains in several days, but perhaps a week passed before the first train arrived. These were cattle cars, used for moving livestock from one place to another. My aunt, with her 6 children, started to leave. Now, she had 7 children, but the oldest one was already 16 years or 17 years old, and her husband, both were taken to labor camp. When you reach that age, you were taken to a labor camp, and if you ever saw Jews with numbers on their arms, those were the numbers, if you were to a labor camp. My mother begged her not to go, my aunt. My aunt said she could not stand the constant crying from her children due to their hunger. They all got on that first transport train and left, never to be seen again by my family. A few days later, a second transport train arrived. It was similar to the other, cattle cars. My mother was being used as an interpreter since she could, read, write, and speak fluent German. On the platform, she stood next to the commandant. He was accompanied by a sergeant in black uniform, the official dress code of the Gestapo, or Gestapo, as the German used to say. My mother observed them putting 2 buckets in each car, one filled with water and the other for toilet use. Can you imagine those small buckets that farmers used to milk in the old days? In her most respectful voice, my mother addressed the commandant, telling him that she knew where we were going and that this little bucket of water wasn't going to make it. Surely you won't want the population along the way to witness the brutality of the civilized Germans. The Gestapo sergeant unholstered his pistol and put it to my mother's head, ready to fire. A Jew was not permitted to address the Germans unless spoken to. The commandant intervened, admonishing the sergeant, calling him an idiot, you dumkar, for not realizing that by killing my mother, they would be losing their interpreter as well. Next, we saw the replacement of the water bucket with an oil drum filled with water. They herded us into the car, 40 or 50 to a car. It was just about standing room only. With no food, we were on our way to Auschwitz. The trip would last several days. God knows how many of the people would have died because many of them were sick already, weak, and surely my mother probably saved God knows how many hundreds of them by that act of courage. And my mother was very gutsy. While crossing Czechoslovakia, the last country before Poland and Auschwitz, Slovak partisans blew up a portion of the railway. The Nazis were forced to reroute us back to Austria. There they divided the human cargo amongst local manufacturers. We all became slave labor. My family was dumped in a large lumber mill. They worked the adults long hours while feeding us hunger portions. The owner of the mill was a rabid Nazi. He had a large swastika tattooed on his chest. I must also add that we were not the only ones there. There were French prisoners of war and also Italian prisoners of war. But obviously, we were not treated the same way. They took much better care of the prisoners of war. In order to supplement our diet, my mother, after a long days of work, would sneak out to a nearby farmer's village and barter for food. She would knit clothes for their babies, and in return receive milk, eggs, cheese, and some bread and butter. This was a very dangerous enterprise, for had she been caught, she would have been shot. The farmers would have been shot also. They were forbidden from helping Jews. That was the law. One night, a few weeks later, my mother didn't return as usual. We had no idea what might have happened to her, and we were worried sick. Panic began to set in. Without our mother, we were doomed. She was like an eagle spreading her wings, covering and protecting us. Although she was only 10 feet 10, she stood 10 feet tall. I mean, she was 4 feet 10, but she stood 10 feet tall. She was our heart and our soul. She had three qualities. One was guts, and one was she was very brilliant, very smart. She's the one who was the businesswoman who created the factories and everything. My father, more or less a designer. In fact, I asked many a times, where was your father all this time? I said, my father was on the bus. My mother was driving it. Not that he was he was a very good man, very scholarly, very smart, a great chess player. But my mother was the initiator. And she's the one who went after something she wanted. And what she wanted is to save us. She managed to save her parents and her brother. She convinced the Germans that her parents were old and sickly, and she was busy with us, with four of us, 4 children and a husband, and that they should allow her brother to take care of their parents. Her brother otherwise would have gone to a labor camp, and very few people survived labor camps in Germany. Some days went by, then one evening she returned telling us that she had been, that she had been caught and put in jail. She never explained how she managed to gain her release, and we never asked. Many years later, at the age of 82, we buried our beloved mother in Jerusalem, and along with her was buried the secret that saved our lives. Not long after our mother's return, a transport train arrived, and the Germans loaded us onto it. It was bound for Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in northern Germany near Hanover. The reason I'm going to tell you where it was, because Hanover was very close to the Baltic Sea and the Northern Sea. So in the winter, it was very, very cold. And all we had is the clothes we left our house in Hungary with some underwear. We didn't have coats. Our shoes were already all with holes and everything else. And we had to go through a winter up in northern Germany. It was early summer when we arrived in Bergen-Belsen. By this time, it had become a full-fledged death camp. Although there were no gas chambers, as at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Chełmno, Sobibor, and many of the other places, or others, mostly in Poland, it was still a death camp, just using a different method of killing. It was starvation, method of reducing daily portions which killed you. The ensuing weakness made you vulnerable to diseases like dysentery and typhoid that hastened your death. Hygiene was so lacking that the barracks were inundated with lice and other parasites. The lice were biting day and night. My mother's solution to this problem was to have us eat the lice. She reasoned that we were just taking back what the lice had taken from us. The dysentery was all over the place. The whole camp was like one big bathroom. People didn't bother even to go to the bathroom. There was no hygiene whatsoever. There was no privacy. There was no ladies' bathroom and men's bathroom. There was only one place, and it was open, and most people couldn't make it in time. People were dropping dead regularly in all places. Many people just gave up, lay down, and died. Every morning at the gate of the camp, there would be piles of corpses 2 to 3 stories high. They would be cleared away only to be replaced with fresh bodies the next morning, and so on and so on. By the age of 7, I've seen more death than life. There was another boy my age in the camp that I paired up with. We were always foraging for food. We quickly learned to follow the German officers as they came out of their mess hall. They were always chewing on something as they left, and we jumped on what they discarded on the ground. Usually, there was not much more than a taste, but that taste lingered enough to enjoy it. It supplemented our once daily ration of a handful of rock-hard black bread and some warm water that had some color to it that was supposed to be soup. By the way, the thing that we picked up from the ground, if you have ever been, and I'm sure you all were in restaurants or at home, and you have a nice meal, and you finish it, yet there is a little thing remaining on the dish, and you pick it up, put it in your mouth, and revives the memory of what you ate. The taste buds act like that. That's why one little thing that they dropped on the floor that they didn't finish was enough to give us that feeling that we actually filled up our stomachs. And of course, beside the soup, by the way, the bread was about the size of a small watermelon that was supposed to be enough for a family of 6. My parents and the 4 of us. My grandfather and my grandmother and my uncle, they got their own. But it was a small thing, very small, and that means that every day we had about that much bread and a little water. Now that was starvation. And of course, plenty of flies. The German officers called my friend and I kleine jüdische Schweinehunden, little Jewish pig dogs. But as long as there was something on the ground for us and plenty of flies, who cared? One day I complained to my mother about a bad headache. My mother checked my head, a large swelling around, an abscess on the back of my skull. She found, fortunately for us, one of the detainees in our barracks was a physician. He had his black doctor's satchel with him. After examining my head, he told my mother that the abscess was very bad and it penetrated my skull. He added he couldn't believe that I was still alive. The doctor said he would have to clean all the pus from the abscess, cut out parts of my skull, the parts that have been destroyed, and in fact I still have like a 2.5, 3 inch long gorge in my skull in the back here, about an inch wide and about a half an inch deep, because it never fused completely, perfect. As he lacked anything to put me to sleep or even dull the pain, he asked my mother to hold me tight so I wouldn't move when the pain became unbearable, because he was working inside my brain. When he finished, he showed us a metallic dish the size of a cereal bowl filled with pus. The doctor again apologized for not having any painkiller. My mother thanked him and then took me to our bunk. When your stomach has been empty for so long, how much can a little headache count for? It's amazing that when you are hungry, day in, day out, just imagine you get up in the morning late, you don't have time to have breakfast. You're very busy at work, you don't have time for lunch. You come home, you are so tired, you just lay down without dinner. Just imagine it's going on for a couple of hundred days, day after day after day. How many people can actually survive that? How did we? My mother. In April of 1945, after 10 months in Bergen-Belsen, the Germans began to load transfer trains to transport several thousand of us to another camp. Despite not knowing the destination, our mother packed us onto the train. We were traveling for many days, perhaps weeks, stopping only periodically to unload the dead. An older fellow was next to me, who blocked the cold air from biting me. He had already been dead a few days. The train stopped again, and this time his body was removed. This angered me, as I had just lost my cover and my pillow. Death ceased to mean anything to me. It was just corpses laying all over the place. In fact, when the British who liberated Bergen-Belsen, they found 13,000 corpses laying on the ground. The reason my mother wanted to leave the camp at the time, she got in trouble with the head couple, who was in charge of food and everything else. And my mother was the interpreter, so she had some kind of protection. They wouldn't touch her. But she threatened him because he was taking the food and selling the best part of the soup. That's why we got only colored water, because the best part was on the bottom. He would give it to his friends or sell it. And my mother said, this thing should go to the sick people first. And after the war, I'll see that you hang. So he had it in for her. At the first chance, he would have probably killed her. So she took advantage of this transport. We didn't know where it was going, but she knew that if we stayed in Bergen-Belsen, we would have died. After a time, we awoke one morning to find the doors to the transport cars wide open. Haltingly, we left the train and discovered that the Nazi guards were all gone. The train had stopped in the middle of a forest. From the darkness of the trees, we heard a loud rumble. Not knowing what to expect, panic took over. This we thought would be our final destination. Here is where the bastards would slaughter us. Sure enough, we spotted a tank crawling out of the woods. Could see the turret was not pointed at the train. The hatch opened and a soldier's head popped out. As he rose, we could all see that his uniform was different from the Nazis. My father yelled, "Americans." And then the crying, yelling, and cheering began. The celebration went on for a long time. We were saved, we were liberated by the Americans. I just have to mention here Frank Thomas, lieutenant with the 30th Division of Infantry, who I got in contact with only this past summer. I could never finish my story of who actually liberated us. And here, it was him, his division. And I asked him about the tank, because when the turret opened, the soldier that came out from the tank was a Jew, an American Jew. The tank was loaded with chocolate, so he was handing it out. There were not many children. You have to remember, 1.6 million children were destroyed. When you take 6 million, 1.6 million would be about the number of children. 1/3 children, 1/3 adults, 1/3 aged. So most of the children were destroyed. That's an argument I had with my older brother. He said there were many children, so I said, not Narcan. The fact is that after the war, we were brought to Paris, and they plastered our picture on the front page of most of the big papers, and who were there? Just the four of us. We reboarded our transport train and traveled a few hours to Hillersleben, a large town on the Rhine River, where the river is deep and wide. We could see the bridge crossing. The river had been bombed out. Clearly, this was the final destination the Nazis had in mind for us when we were herded onto the train in Bergen-Belsen. They were going to push the train off the bridge into the river with the car doors locked tight. There would have been no way out. And Lieutenant Thomas Frank also told me that the train left with 2,500 people, left Bergen-Belsen, and they were actually following the train all along. And finally it stopped in Farsleben, not very far from there. They were not sure what the train contained. If they knew that the train had war material, they would have bombed it. And until they knew that we were Jews, and they found it out somehow, they just followed us to see where they are taking us. We reboarded our transport train. Okay, I said it already. Okay. In Hillersleben, my father and grandfather contracted typhus. The disease was rampant among the survivors, and many, many thousands died. I think something like 9,000 also. My father amongst them. Fortunately, my grandfather, who had typhoid too, he survived. After a time, the Joint Distribution Committee, an American Jewish welfare organization, separated my siblings and I from my mother and grandparents, and we were taken to Paris. There we stayed at the Grand Hotel, a 5-star hotel. The French media made a big deal out of the four of us, as we were the first children to be freed by the Americans. Later, we were moved to a pension, which is like a boarding house or a small hotel. We were reunited with our family. There they fattened us up, working to help us overcome the effects of starvation we had endured at the hands of the Nazis. We left there after a few weeks and soon arrived in Marseille, a large port city in southern France on the Mediterranean Sea. We were looking and feeling much better. In a few days, we boarded a ship and embarked on a voyage that ended in Israel. When we arrived in Israel, it was late summer of 1945. My grandfather left the ship, and when he set foot on solid ground, he fell to his knees, kissing the ground and thanking God for bringing us all to this point. We all joined him. It is a moment that I will always remember and cherish. At the insistence of my grandfather, my two brothers and I were put into an ultra-Orthodox institution, and my sister was sent to an Orthodox orphanage for girls. Orthodox Jews don't keep boys and girls together. They're separated. My mother, however, was a more modern thinker, fought her father over our placement. and prevailed. We boys were moved to a moderate Orthodox orphanage in Bnei Brak. It was part of the Panevėžio Yeshiva. Yeshiva is like a religious university, and we were a part of it. Many of the boys there had survived the concentration camps, but mostly they were hidden children, those who had no surviving families. Upon arriving in Israel, these boys were given Hebrew names. Actually, most of the boys were, because very few concentration camp survivors were boys, were children. So who were the hidden children? If you lived in Poland, for instance, and you knew the Nazis are coming, and you knew what they were going to do, they took their children, they would hand it to one of the farmers, give them their farms, give them their businesses, give them their homes, just to save the children. And after the war, they would come back and pick them up. But of course, they never came back. Most of Polish Jews were killed. So they were raised by Catholics, Catholic farms, or Catholic homes, and they were heroic for doing it, because had they been caught, they would have been dead. After the war, there was a big question: what to do with them? Is it the task of Catholics to convert Jews to Christianity? So they actually asked the question from the cardinal who later on became the Pope, the Polish Pope. And he told them, by all means, send them back. And when they're 18 years old, if they choose to come back, we'll accept them. But he made sure that every child was returned. When they came, they had no families. So they came to the orphanage. Life in the orphanage was tough. The boys had come from every country in Eastern Europe. The place was a true Babel, with everyone speaking a different language. After we couldn't understand each other and just fought all the time, I'm sure this was not just our lack of understanding of each other, but also us expressing the horror we had experienced. It was the head of the orphanage, Mrs. Monk, and her husband, who kept us from killing each other. This couple was truly righteous, and I shall never forget them. Mrs. Monk was up all night. She learned over a short time the times when we were wetting our beds, because we were all wetting our beds. In fact, we wetted our beds till the age of 11 or 12. And of course, the nightmares. So she would come and knock on you, wake you up to go to the bathroom, to make sure that you're not going to make it bed. She was a very tough lady on the outside, but she had a golden heart, and so was her husband. Personally, I was filled with rage. They could not control me. They were always looking to send me to a juvenile delinquent home. But steady intercession and lobbying for my mother kept me in the orphanage. I lived there for 7 years, until the age of 14. After finishing 8th grade, my mother convinced the government to put us into a yeshiva high school. Named Drashat Noam, it was an exclusive and pricey institution. My brothers and I were the poor kids there, as we were wards of the government. Most of the kids there were third, fourth generation Israelis. And they were children of business people, and they were well-to-do kids. The food and lodging were, good, and the education was excellent. It was a 4-year program, and by the time I graduated, I lost my rage. I also learned how to make a little money. A lesson I shared with my brother Yaakov, not a lesson. What I shared with him is the money I made, because he liked to date girls, and somebody had to pay for his dates. So I worked, I had nothing to do with the money, and I gave him the money, and I'm very happy about it, because at the age of 20, in the Sinai campaign, 1956, he was a machine gunner, and they were fighting in Rafiah, which is northern Sinai, southern Gaza, and he was carrying this machine gun with a tripod, and they were fighting room to room, and he pushed the door, and there was a Palestinian there with a machine gun, and he cut him almost in half. So whatever we did for him, today, when I talk to my brother, I remember my brother, Moshe, he didn't like to eat much. So he always pushed money to Yaakov to finish his food for him. And I said, well, in 20 years he managed to eat enough for maybe 50 years or so. During those years, my mother remarried. My stepfather was a man who had lost his wife and 3 children, and I'll tell you about him in a minute. He had a good heart, but was filled with rage, much like I have been. But he worshipped my mother, and they had 2 children together, a boy, Itzik, and a daughter, Miriam. It was good to have a little brother and sister. In fact, till today, I have one daughter, she's married, and she has 2 boys. My brother in Israel, my older brother, has 4 boys. They're all professionals, and between them they have 13, soon to be 14. And every time anybody in my family is born, I say, yeah, that bastard didn't succeed. The Samet family is thriving and prospering. So his plan didn't work. Now let me just say a word about my stepfather. Having all that rage, we were always worried that perhaps in the concentration camps, he was a kind of not a collaborator, but there was what they call the Jewish committee. Their job was to keep the camps as clean as possible. They're the ones who gathered the bodies overnight, and they're the ones who were in charge of the kitchen. And since he never spoke, we thought, well, maybe he was one of them. And they were brutal. They had to be, because if they were not brutal enough, the Germans would kill him. That was one of their tests, brutality. So anyhow, my mother and my stepfather, Moshe Schwartz, they were walking down King George Street in Jerusalem, and they passed by this restaurant that seemed to be very boisterous. And there were these 2, 3 men at the door. They looked like they already had a little bit to drink. And when they saw me, says, Morris Schwartz, that was his name, in Europe, in Romania, though he was a Hungarian. And he turned around, didn't recognize, kept going. I said, Morris Schwartz. So my mother said, shouldn't we stop and see who they are, what they want? So anyhow, they came, and my stepfather said to them, I'm sorry, I don't know who you are. And they said, no, you don't know us, but we know you. I said, what do you mean? I said, because of you, we are here today celebrating. What do you mean? You see, when they came to his town, the Germans brought all the Jews, ready to pack them on trucks and take them to the train. But before they did that, they always asked for people with some kind of a trade. Now, my stepfather was a baker. He had a wholesale bakery where he supplied most of the town stores with bread. So, of course, they picked him up right away. And they took him and they put him in the officers' mess. But every morning, they would put him on a truck, in the back of the truck, and they would go to the market. There was a driver and a soldier, a guard. He was sitting in the back. And he was doing all the shopping. They paid. Then when he came back, there were always Jews working on the fence. The fence was electric, and during the day, during the night, Jews who couldn't take it anymore would jump on the fence and commit suicide that way. So they stopped the electricity, and every day you had a whole bunch of them working on the fence, fixing the fence. So as he passed, coming back by them, he would drop a bread, salami. He made sure that they won't be able to tell that that stuff was missing. And he said, that little bit of food that you dropped for us is why we are here today celebrating. So all of a sudden we discovered, after all these years, that he was a good man. But unfortunately, what happened before that is what destroyed his life. When the Nazis came, he knew that they're going to take him all. So he gave his children, 3 children, a son and 2 daughters, to his neighbor. He sold his company before all that, and he sold his house, and he gave all that money to the neighbor, that he's going to pick him up. Now, his wife was taken immediately, and she probably was taken to Auschwitz, so she never came back. He was looking for his children. He couldn't find a neighbor. He started to go from house to house up the street, and nobody would talk to him. Finally, somebody at distance said, as soon as he got on the truck, he called the Gestapo. He called the Gestapo, and they came and picked up the children. So he never saw his children again. Now, he married my mother and had a brother, and I had a son, Isaac, and a daughter, Miriam. Miriam lives in Pittsburgh. She's married to a dentist. She herself is a social worker. She's retired now. She has a picture of her father with his former wife and the 3 children, half brother and half sisters. She doesn't know their names. He would never, ever talk about them. So till today, she's trying to find out their names. And in my case, they have been after me to talk for, God knows, for so many years. And my answer always was, I'm sorry, I can't look back. I see the abyss. But about 5 years ago, after they kept going after me, I said, you know, everybody around me seems to be getting old and reaching the point where they're going to be gone. There are 10,000 survivors die every day now. And I am probably one of the very youngest who survived. So I said, what's going to happen after I'm gone, after my generation is gone? So first of all, I don't know, you know Steven Spielberg? He made the movie Schindler's List. The movie was, I imagine quite a few of you saw that movie. It was about a concentration camp and about a commandant who was a sadistic killer. Anyhow, that movie made him over $1 billion in profit. He dedicated that money, anything coming out of that movie, to create a living memorial foundation where he interviewed, I was one of them, so was my brother in Israel, my sister. It was over 2 hours. He made a video, and he made 3 videos, actually. One goes to the Holocaust Center in Washington, one in Yad Vashem in Israel, and I got one, and they had a 4th one in California. So that was one thing that I've done, and my whole story is on that. I'm not allowed to sell it. I'm not allowed to publish it. I can show it, but I'm not allowed to do anything, and I have no intention to do it. Then one day I get a phone call from this Spanish artist. He wants to come to my house and draw my profile. And while he was drawing my profile, his wife, who was a professor at Bennington University, she's going to ask me questions. And I said, what are you going to do with that? So he did. It was about 1.5 hours. He said, well, probably it's going to be in some museum in Spain. There's going to be a button. If you want to hear the story, you push the button so you can look at me and also listen to the story. I have been going to schools. I was in Chandler, I was in Monaco. I think this is maybe my 10th. And thanks to my good friend, Bill Lynch. I don't know if anybody here knows Bill Lynch well enough. There is a family that I consider the American flag. Bill Lynch is a retired FBI special agent. His wife, Julie, was with the CIA. His daughter, she's a lawyer with the IRS. And his son is a captain, naval intelligence. Can you get more American than that? So I'm very, very proud to be a friend of his. And he made it a mission in his life to see as many kids that I can have he'll bring. So I'm going to some school this afternoon. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Judah, for coming.